He was born into privilege, bred for comfort, and expected to spend his life stalking deer across misty highland hills. Instead, he ended up watching young men drown in mud and fire, gambling his family fortune on a dying political party, and racing against time as Europe slid toward catastrophe. This is the story of Archibald Sinclair, the quiet aristocrat who tried to shout against the roar of history while standing in the shadow of the loudest man in British politics, Winston Churchill. Autumn, 1890. London is thick with coal smoke and horse dung. In a smart house in Chelsea, a child opens his eyes for the first time. His name is Archibald Henry MacDonald Sinclair. He will never know a world without power. The old Highland blood of the clan Sinclair runs in his veins, tied to windswept estates at the northern edge of Scotland. But power for Archibald will never feel safe. It will always feel like something that can be taken away. It starts with loss. When Archibald is still a small boy, his father dies. The figure who should have taught him what it means to be a man, to be a Sinclair, simply disappears from the story. In place of a father, there is an absence, and into that absence steps the land itself. Caithness, the far northern county where the Sinclair estates lie. Stone crofts battered by Atlantic winds. Peat smoke curling in the rain. A harsh country that doesn't care who your ancestors were, only whether you can endure. In this raw landscape, the future Viscount Thurso learns something the London drawing rooms never could teach him: that people can love their land and hate their landlords at the same time. The crofters, small tenant farmers, have long memories. They remember evictions, clearances, broken promises. When the young Archibald rides out across the estate, he sees not just his own privilege but the cost of it. It lodges in him like a splinter. If he inherits power, what will he do with it? From the wild north he is sent south, into the machinery that shapes Britain's ruling class, Eton. The very name glitters with expectation. Boys who walk these cloisters will grow into cabinet ministers, generals, bishops. Some will rule an empire. Archibald arrives with the right name, the right pedigree, but not the right temperament for arrogance. He is athletic, courteous, reserved. He plays games hard, but he plays them fair. He hates bullies. He notices boys no one else sees. In the echoing halls, another tension takes hold. On one side, the traditions that have built the British establishment. On the other, unsettling new ideas. Liberalism, democracy, Irish home rule, women demanding the vote, socialists whispering about equality. Eton trains him to believe in duty and hierarchy. The wider world is starting to ask whether those hierarchies deserve to survive. Archibald stands between these forces. An aristocrat with a conscience, a conservative by inheritance, a liberal by instinct. Then, as if history has been waiting just off stage, the clock starts ticking. By the time he moves from Eton to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, Europe is a powder keg. The great powers are arming, alliances tightening like a noose. Archibald chooses the army not as an escape from responsibility, but as a form of it. If he is to be a leader, he must learn to lead not just in Parliament, but under fire. In 1910, he earns his commission in the Scots Guards, a regiment of polished boots, shining buttons, and ancient pride. None of them know yet how completely that pride will be ground into the mud. The summer of 1914 arrives warm and golden. Picnics, cricket, endless confidence. In London clubs, older men talk casually about a short, sharp war, if it ever comes. Then, in Sarajevo, a shot is fired. The map of Europe begins to bleed. Britain declares war on Germany. For Archibald, there is no hesitation. The young officer leaves behind polished barracks for the clattering trains and crowded troopships of a country stumbling into industrial slaughter. The Western Front does not care that he is Sir Archibald Sinclair, 4th Baronet of Ulster. It does not care that his ancestors sat in Parliament centuries before. The Front cares about one thing: survival. The quiet, sportsmanlike young officer from Eton finds himself in a world where the sky is shredded by artillery, where men who were laughing over breakfast can vanish into a burst of shrapnel by dusk. Picture him in a trench at dawn, cold water lapping at his boots, his breath a ghost in the air. It is too quiet. He knows what that means. Somewhere, invisible, German guns are being wheeled into position. He glances along the trench line, sees the faces of his men. Some farmers, some clerks, some barely old enough to shave. They are looking at him. Not at his rank, not at his title, at him. If he breaks, they break. The barrage begins like the end of the world. Shells scream overhead and detonate with sickening, concussive force. Earth erupts. carrying with it fragments of wood, metal, and human beings. The ground shakes. The air becomes a storm of steel. Men cling to the trench walls, praying, cursing, crying out for mothers they will never see again. Somewhere under that inferno, Archibald Sinclair learns a lesson he will carry into every cabinet room and Commons debate. Decisions, made in calm, oak-paneled rooms, eventually land in places like this. He is not a reckless hero. He does not leap onto parapets with a pistol held high. His courage is colder, more frightening. The refusal to look away. The refusal to treat any of this as abstract. When he writes letters home for men who cannot write, when he walks along the line at night, listening to the exhausted mutterings of soldiers who have seen too much, he begins to grasp the true cost of war and the true weight of political failure. The war drags on. Years, not months. Entire battalions disappear. Cities back home fill with women in black. Amid this catastrophe, Archibald's talents are noticed. He is moved to staff positions, where clarity of mind can save as many lives as bravery at the front. He works close to the top of the British command structure, watching generals juggle maps, telegrams, and lives. Strategy here, slaughter there. Power feels both immense and horribly fragile. Then, toward the end of the conflict, something happens that will shape the rest of his life. He crosses paths with a man whose voice will echo through the entire century. Winston Churchill. Churchill at this time is already a comet in British politics. Brilliant, erratic, controversial. After the disaster of Gallipoli, he has fought his way back into government, taking up roles connected to the war effort. Archibald becomes, for a time, his personal military secretary, the efficient, composed officer beside the explosive, restless politician. It is an odd pairing. The quiet Highland baronet and the boisterous half-American maverick. What Archibald sees is intoxicating and alarming in equal measure. Churchill works at a pace that would kill most men, driven by a volcanic energy and a bottomless need to shape events. He dictates memos at all hours, sketches ideas for new campaigns, fumes against timidity. To be near him is to stand next to a furnace. But there is something else. Between the bursts of rhetoric, Churchill talks of ideas that resonate with the young officer from Caithness. The duty of the state, to its people, the need to avoid the kind of blunders that cause carnage in the trenches, the importance of air power in any future war. For Archibald Sinclair, this is politics as he has never quite imagined it. Urgent, consequential, intertwined with the fate of every nameless soldier huddled in the mud. A question begins to form, quietly, dangerously. If men like Churchill can bend the course of war from an office, who is shaping peace? Who will make sure that the next generation does not find itself back in the same trenches? The armistice of 1918 feels less like a victory than a pause in a disaster. Europe is shattered. Empires have collapsed. Millions are dead or broken. Britain has survived, but it is not the same country Archibald marched out to defend. Strikes, unemployment, the influenza pandemic that kills more than the shells ever did. This is the home front he returns to. And everywhere, beneath the grief, something is stirring. Anger. The old political order begins to wobble. The once mighty Liberal Party, the party of Gladstone and Lloyd George, is splintered and exhausted. Its leaders have quarreled during the war. Its message seems blurred. On its left, a new force is rising with relentless, disciplined energy. The Labour Party. Men who once voted Liberal now look to Labour to protect workers, jobs, homes. On its right, the Conservatives stand ready, organized and well-funded, to snap up disillusioned voters. Caught between them, liberalism stands on the edge of extinction. If the Liberals fall, so does the political space for people like Archibald Sinclair, people who believe in freedom but also fairness, in individual rights but also social responsibility. The party that once dominated the 19th century is now fighting for its life. This is where the rivalry that will define Archibald's political career begins. Not yet with a single named enemy, but with a double threat. On one side, the chilly, disciplined machine of the Conservative Party, determined to protect privilege and empire. On the other, the fiery idealism and organizational strength of Labour, promising to reshape society from the ground up. In between them, a narrow, dangerous ridge, and a question. Is there still room in Britain for liberalism? After the war, Churchill himself is politically adrift, battered by controversy and changing allegiances. He and Archibald talk not as soldier and minister now, but as two men who have seen the cost of failure at the front and chaos at home. Churchill urges him toward politics. He knows talent when he sees it, But he is also, whether either man admits it or not, a looming competitor. Churchill commands attention effortlessly. Newspapers hang on his every phrase. If Archibald follows him into Parliament, he will be fighting not just opponents across the aisle, but the gravitational pull of his friend's overwhelming personality. Archibald hesitates, and then makes the choice that will define him. He could retreat to the Highlands, manage his estates, hunt, fish, sit on local committees, live a comfortable, quiet life. Many in his position do exactly that. Instead, he steps forward. He will not just comment on politics from the sidelines. He will risk his name, his money, his peace on the brutal battlefield of elections. The first plunge into electoral politics is a shock, even for a man who has seen war. There are no shells, but there is a different kind of bombardment. Heckling crowds, hostile newspapers, opponents who twist his words and sneer at his background. To some working-class voters, he is simply another laird in a good coat, no matter what he says about reform. To some conservatives, he is a traitor to his class. To more radical voices, any aristocrat claiming to care about the poor is a hypocrite by definition. Yet in village halls and cold, damp meeting rooms across Caithness and Sutherland, something unexpected happens. People listen. The young baronet speaks not with the booming certainty of Churchill, but with a steady, carefully reasoned conviction. He talks about the Highlands not as a playground for the rich, but as a place where men and women struggle to make a living from indifferent soil. He promises land reform, better education, improved housing. He does not promise miracles. He promises effort. Time is against him. The political map of Britain is shifting fast. Every election could be the one that squeezes the Liberals out entirely, leaving a stark choice between red Labour and blue Conservative. If Archibald cannot prove that a Highland Liberal voice still matters, now, in this narrow window, his whole project may collapse before it truly begins. The nights are long, the questions sharper. Why should we trust you? What did your class do for us during the clearances? Why did your party break its promises before the war? Each question a reminder that history is not a clean slate he can write upon, but a ledger filled with debts. He answers, again and again, with the same stubborn persistence he showed under artillery fire, by not looking away. He acknowledges past wrongs. He insists that land can be managed more fairly, that government can serve remote communities as well as cities, that Britain does not have to choose between conservative repression and socialist revolution. He offers not a slogan, but a bridge. And gradually, vote by vote, hall by hall, something shifts. The crofter who muttered angrily at the back of the first meeting shows up again, this time closer to the front. The local paper prints his speeches with a little less mockery. Political rivals begin to notice that this quiet aristocrat is not fading after a single campaign. When the votes are finally counted, in the chill of a northern night, the numbers tell the story. Archibald Sinclair has done it. He is elected Member of Parliament for Caithness and Sutherland. The boy from the wind-scoured estates, the officer who watched men die in the mud for decisions made in London, now has a seat in the very house where those decisions are forged. As he walks through the doors of the House of Commons for the first time, past the carved stone and the echoing lobbies, another kind of battlefront opens before him. Inside, the clocks tick inexorably. Outside, Labour grows stronger, the Conservatives tighten their grip, and Europe begins, almost imperceptibly, to tremble again. Archibald Sinclair has finally entered the arena, but the time left to save his party, and perhaps something larger than his party, is already running dangerously short. He walked into the House of Commons thinking he'd finally arrived. 3 years later, he would be out on the street, his party shattered, and the man he once served as a junior aide would be roaring back toward power. Archibald Sinclair hadn't entered politics to watch history slip through his fingers, but time and Winston Churchill were about to test just how far a quiet Highland Liberal could go in a world that preferred louder men. In those first months after the 1922 election, Sinclair moves through Westminster like a man exploring the engine room of a ship he once only saw from the shore. Smoke from cheap cigarettes hangs under the lamps. Messengers hurry along green-carpeted corridors with telegrams that might topple governments. In the chamber itself, the benches creak as two great parties, Conservative and Labour, jostle for dominance. The Liberals who once ruled this room now sit scattered and diminished, like the fading memory of an old empire. He is one of them now, the new member for Caithness and Sutherland. His name is still occasionally mispronounced. Some MPs barely glance up when he speaks. Yet when he rises, tall, spare, controlled, To talk about land reform, or about crofters who choose between boots and bread, it becomes clear this is not just another laird defending his privileges. He speaks with the precision of a staff officer and the moral unease of a man who has seen too many young faces in the mud. But he has walked into a building already on fire. The Liberals are divided between the followers of David Lloyd George, the dynamic, divisive wartime prime minister, and those who cannot forgive him for splitting the party and governing with the Conservatives. Old enemies glare at each other across the same bench. The great liberal themes, free trade, civil liberties, social reform, are drowned out by arguments about who betrayed whom in 1916. And somewhere in the background, like distant thunder, is the name Winston Churchill. Once a liberal minister, now expelled from government after the disaster of Gallipoli, Churchill spends these years in an uncomfortable wilderness. He holds no great office. He has lost and regained seats. Yet he remains famous in a way Sinclair is not. Newspapers still chase his quotes. Cartoonists still draw his cigar and bulldog jaw. It is as if politics itself is waiting to see what he will do next. In this crowded, bitter chamber, Archibald Sinclair tries to do something unfashionable. Legislate. He throws himself into committee work, constituency cases, debates on Scottish issues. He refuses to treat the Liberal benches as a hospice. If the party is dying, he intends it to die fighting. Then, in 1924, the axe falls. The election that year is brutal. The Liberals are squeezed from both sides. Conservative warnings about socialism on one flank, Labour promises of real change on the other. In Caithness and Sutherland, the contest is close, but not close enough. When the final figures are read out, Sinclair has lost. Just 2 years after entering Parliament, he is out. Imagine the journey north that winter. The overnight train clattering through darkness. The carriage cold. Newspapers on the seat beside him screaming headlines about Conservative landslides and Liberal collapse. When he steps onto the platform in Wick, sleet slanting across the harbour, men who once assumed he would be in Westminster for life now avoid his eyes or murmur awkward condolences. It would be easy, almost respectable, to stop here. To retreat to the estates, to manage tenants, attend local functions, build a comfortable private life around fishing and stalking and committee meetings. Plenty of defeated MPs do exactly that. Few people would blame him. But the war did something to Archibald Sinclair that defeat at the ballot box cannot undo. Once you have watched artillery flatten a landscape in minutes, you lose patience with cowardice disguised as realism. Britain is changing. Democracy is expanding. Ordinary people are demanding a say in their own destiny. He cannot quite shake the conviction that liberalism, properly renewed, still has work to do. So he starts again. The lost years between 1924 and 1929 are not lost at all. He becomes more deeply involved in Highland affairs, pushing for fair rents, better access to land, improved services for remote communities. He builds networks within what is left of the Liberal organization. He reads obsessively: economics, history, reports on housing, agriculture, unemployment. If he is going back to Westminster, he will go back armed not just with ideals but with detailed, costed plans. By 1928, the tide flickers. The Conservatives look tired. Unemployment is high. The Liberals, desperate for relevance, rally around a bold platform promising to conquer unemployment through public works and reforms. They need candidates with credibility in both town and country, people who can make liberalism sound like the future rather than a nostalgic echo. They turn again to Archibald Sinclair. In the 1929 election campaign, he moves across the far north like a man racing a storm. Village halls smell of damp coats and paraffin. At each stop, he hammers the same message: that the state can and must act to create jobs, that poverty in the glens is not inevitable, that freedom without security is fragile and hollow. He is still an aristocrat in a good coat, but now he is also the man who came back. Voters recognize the effort that takes. This time, the count goes his way. Caithness and Sutherland returns him to Parliament. The Liberals, though nowhere near their old strength, once again hold the balance of power between Labour and Conservatives. For a moment, it seems as if history might be generous after all. Perhaps there is still time. Then Wall Street crashes. The Great Depression spreads like a stain across the globe. Britain reels. Factories close. Shipyards fall silent. Lines lengthen outside labor exchanges. In the Commons, arguments over old liberal quarrels are swept aside by something more terrifying: the possibility that the economic system itself is failing. In this emergency, Ramsay MacDonald forms a national government in 1931. drawing in conservatives and some liberals to shore up the state. Here, Archibald Sinclair faces a stark choice. Many of his liberal colleagues accept posts in the new government. They talk of national unity, of putting aside party labels in a time of crisis. But unity comes with a price. The abandonment of traditional liberal commitments to free trade and civil liberties. Under pressure from the conservatives, tariffs and restrictions start to appear. The state begins to tilt, subtly but unmistakably, toward protectionism and authoritarian habits. Sinclair is offered the easy road: fall into line, sit on ministerial benches, enjoy the perks of office. Instead, he refuses. He will support measures to stabilize the economy. He will not support turning Britain into a fortress run for the benefit of the already powerful. When the breach becomes too wide, he and a small band of colleagues step away, sitting as independent liberals opposed to the government. It is a mad gamble. The election later that year is a massacre. The national government wins an overwhelming majority. The independent liberals are reduced to a tiny, embattled group. In a chamber overflowing with pro-government MPs, Sinclair now leads a faction that can fit into a single taxi. On paper, it looks like surrender. In fact, it is the moment he becomes something more than a local MP. Colleagues, journalists, even rivals notice his stubbornness. When almost everyone else has chosen survival, Sinclair has chosen principle. It is a small, flickering light in a darkening decade. By 1935, the strain of leading this dwindling band breaks Sir Herbert Samuel, the formal liberal leader. He loses his seat and steps down. The party, once the great engine of British reform, is now a political ruin with a handful of survivors wandering through it. They need a leader. They need, frankly, a caretaker for the funeral. They choose Archibald Sinclair. There is something almost cruel about the timing. To accept the leadership of the Liberal Party now is to take command of a ship that is already half submerged. But he accepts without hesitation the oath he swore in the trenches to bear responsibility when it is thrust upon him. Still holds. Picture the House of Commons in those years. On one side, a solid wall of conservative and national liberal benches, buttressed by wealthy donors and the machinery of the state. On the other, the rising, disciplined ranks of labor, with Clement Attlee's quiet steel hardening their resolve. Between them, a narrow strip of green leather where Archibald Sinclair sits as leader of a party that many consider politically dead. He has to decide, what is liberalism for now? What is the point of this remnant? The answer, he believes, lies not in nostalgia for Gladstone, but in facing the new monsters of the age: fascism, dictatorship, and the slide toward another war. In Germany, Hitler is rearming and roaring about Lebensraum. In Italy, Mussolini parades troops under black banners. In Britain, Sir Oswald Mosley marches his black shirts through East End streets, taunting Jewish shopkeepers, drunk on borrowed European hatreds. Sinclair throws the weight of his tiny party into this fight. He denounces the British Union of Fascists in Parliament. He backs sanctions against Mussolini for the invasion of Abyssinia. He warns, in speech after speech, that Hitler's regime is not just unpleasant but lethal, and that British weakness will invite catastrophe. And he focuses obsessively on air power. The boy who once watched birds wheel over Caithness cliffs now studies the shadow they cast on the future. The next war, he argues, will be decided above cities, not just in trenches. Whoever controls the skies will control everything beneath them. He demands that the Royal Air Force be strengthened, not as an instrument of aggression, but as a shield. Here, his path crosses again and again with Winston Churchill's. Churchill, having rejoined the Conservatives, is himself an outcast within his own party, obsessed with the German threat and the need to rearm. He and Sinclair often find themselves in the same lobbies, voting against the government's complacent defense budgets, their speeches, warning of danger bouncing off a wall of wishful thinking. But the country, weary of war and depression, does not want to listen. When Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns from Munich in 1938, waving a piece of paper and proclaiming "Peace for our time," the House erupts in relief. Members cheer. Crowds outside roar approval. Archibald Sinclair does not cheer. He sits, rigid, watching the jubilation with something like horror. The agreement has sacrificed Czechoslovakia, a democracy, to Hitler's hunger. To Sinclair, it feels less like peace than the quiet that falls while a beast eats just off stage. He rises and says so, calmly but firmly, warning that appeasement will only buy a more terrible war later. The chamber is impatient. He is accused of being a warmonger, of trying to drag Britain into another bloodbath. The newspapers splash Chamberlain's smiling face across front pages. Churchill's and Sinclair's words, when they appear at all, are tucked away in smaller type near the back. In the battle for the public's imagination, Churchill is at least a notorious figure. Sinclair, with his measured tone and careful arguments, is easier to ignore. But history, once again, sides with the pessimists. In September 1939, after Hitler invades Poland, Britain declares war. Sirens wail over blacked-out streets. Children are evacuated from cities with name tags pinned to their coats. Men who survived the trenches watch their sons march away. Sinclair, long one of the few voices saying this day would come, takes no satisfaction. The second catastrophe of his lifetime has begun. Yet even now, the old order clings on. Chamberlain remains prime minister. The early months, the phony war, are marked by hesitancy, half-measures, an almost paralyzed fear of repeating 1914's mistakes. Sinclair watches as opportunity after opportunity is missed to strike decisively against Hitler before he devours more of Europe. Then, in April 1940, comes Norway. The campaign is a fiasco. Poorly planned, badly executed, a shambles of muddled orders and inadequate resources. British troops die on frozen shores for gains that cannot be held. In the Commons, anger that has simmered for years erupts. A two-day debate on the conduct of the war becomes a trial of Chamberlain himself. Archibald Sinclair faces another moment of impossible choice. The conservative machine is pressuring everyone. This is not the time to split hairs, they say. The nation must stand united behind the government. Some warn him that if the Liberals bring down Chamberlain, they will be blamed for any ensuing chaos. Others whisper the opposite, that if he does not act now, he will prove the irrelevance of his party forever. He stands. The chamber hushes. Sinclair delivers a speech as cold and precise as a staff report. He does not rage. He does not thunder. He simply lays out, point by point, the failures of leadership, the cost in lives, the lack of urgency in the face of an existential enemy. And then he drops the hammer. The Liberal Party, he announces, can no longer support Chamberlain's government. It is a small party. But in a tight vote, small numbers matter. The government's majority shrinks to a humiliating sliver. The myth of Chamberlain's authority evaporates. Within days, he resigns. Now the clock moves from fast to frantic. Across the Channel, Hitler unleashes the blitzkrieg on the Low Countries and France. Armored columns punch through defenses with terrifying speed. The British Expeditionary Force staggers under the blow. Every hour the situation deteriorates. Britain cannot afford a power vacuum. The King and the Conservative grandees look frantically for a new Prime Minister. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, is an obvious candidate. Aristocratic, reassuring, acceptable to the establishment. Yet he doubts himself. And the crisis demands someone willing to fight to the last without hesitation. The choice settles, inexorably, on Winston Churchill. For Archibald Sinclair, watching from the Liberal benches, the moment is double-edged. He has just helped unseat one Prime Minister. Now another rises. An old friend, an old mentor, and whether either man admits it or not, a rival for the right to define Britain's wartime soul. Churchill forms a coalition government. He must decide whether to bring the Liberals in to share responsibility or to let them wither on the margins. In the newly re-energized corridors of power, where men stride past with maps under their arms and air raid sirens whine in the distance, a message comes. Churchill wants to see Sinclair. Imagine the scene. Somewhere in the Admiralty, maps of the North Sea spread on the walls, a haze of smoke curling under the ceiling. Churchill, bulldog, faced, rumpled, radiating urgency. Faces Sinclair, immaculate as ever, his manner controlled but his mind racing. The offer is clear and terrifying. Churchill wants him as Secretary of State for Air, the civilian head of the Royal Air Force, with a seat in the War Cabinet. Not just a commentator now, not just a leader of a tiny third party, but one of the handful of men who will direct the air war on which Britain's survival may depend. For a heartbeat, the ghosts of the trenches crowd in. The barrage, the mud, the letters written for dying boys. If he accepts, the decisions he makes will again bleed out into the lives of young pilots in flimsy machines over the Channel. If he refuses, the Liberal voice in the inner circle of power may vanish completely, leaving Churchill and the Conservatives without that fragile, necessary check. He accepts. Soon after, Archibald Sinclair walks through the doors of the Air Ministry. Walls are lined with maps pricked with colored pins marking squadrons and airfields. Telephones shrill incessantly. Typewriters clatter out casualty lists, orders, requisitions. Outside, in the darkening sky over London, searchlights probe for threats that will soon be all too real. The quiet Highland aristocrat who once stood beside Churchill as a junior officer, taking dictation, now takes his place opposite him at the war cabinet table. The rivalry that has simmered in the background for years, between the overwhelming theatrical conservative titan and the precise, determined liberal, is about to play out under the harshest lighting imaginable, and somewhere over the channel, engines are already warming on German airfields. The countdown has changed. It is no longer just the time left to save a party. It is the time left to save a country. His first morning at the Air Ministry, someone puts a single sheet of paper in front of him. Just routine approvals, they say. Fuel allocations. Training schedules. A list of fresh pilots ready to be posted to squadrons in France. He signs. Weeks later, many of the names he has just initialed will be lying in burned-out wrecks on foreign fields. The transformation is brutal and instant. Overnight, Archibald Sinclair has gone from warning about war to becoming one of the men who must feed it. And the clock is already ticking faster than he can think. The building itself feels like a machine under strain. In long, echoing corridors off Whitehall, staff officers hurry past with armfuls of telegrams, their faces gray from lack of sleep. Maps line the walls, bristling with pins and colored strings that shift almost daily. Signals come in from France, from the Mediterranean, from training stations in Canada and Rhodesia. Each message is a decision that cannot be postponed. How many fighters can be spared? Which airfields get concrete runways and which must make do with grass and prayer? Almost at once, the war goes from abstraction to crisis. France collapses with sickening speed. The German advance moves across Sinclair's wall maps like a stain. Airfields overrun. Squadrons forced to abandon machines on the ground. The British Expeditionary Force trapped at Dunkirk. Sinclair sits in the Air Ministry's operations room as red lights flash on the Great Board, indicating aircraft dispatched over the channel. Bomber crews are ordered to attack German columns. Fighters are sent to cover the beaches. Every sortie he authorizes might stretch the RAF beyond what it can replace. The figures are cold and precise. The reality is not. Pilots land, stumbling from cockpits with thousand-yard stares, muttering about the wall of fire and smoke over Dunkirk, about friends who simply never came back on the last sweep. Reports are brought to Sinclair's desk. Losses, ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption. He hears the numbers, but in his mind they come with faces. Boys he's met on inspection tours, laughing over weak tea, telling him, "They're ready for anything, sir." The war is barely weeks old for Britain, and already it is burning through a generation. In the war cabinet, the tempo is ferocious. Sinclair takes his place at the table opposite Churchill, the walls of the cabinet room vibrating faintly with distant explosions. As London's first air raid sirens test their throats, Churchill grumbles and growls, radiating defiant energy, demanding to know how many squadrons can be thrown into the battle tomorrow, how quickly more can be formed, how soon new aircraft can roll off the lines. Sinclair, sharp pencil in hand, answers steadily, giving figures, warning of ceilings, pushing for priorities. They are old comrades now forced into a new rhythm. Churchill playing the part of national lion, Sinclair, the cold voice of arithmetic, that decides how long the roar can last. The rivalry between them takes on a new shape. In public, Churchill is the unmistakable face and voice of defiance. On the radio, he thunders about fighting on the beaches and never surrendering. Sinclair rarely broadcasts. When he does, his tone is measured, almost understated. He does not give Britain its slogans. Instead, he must give it something less glamorous and far more difficult. An air force that can make those slogans something more than bravado. As the last troops leave Dunkirk, Churchill turns to him with the bluntest of demands. The RAF must defend the island or the war is lost. There will be no second miracle if the Luftwaffe gains the skies. This is the point of no return. The Battle of Britain will not just be a military contest. It will be a test of every judgment Sinclair makes over the next few months. Those judgments reach down into the smallest technical questions. How many hours of training can be cut without turning pilots into suicide cases? Which factories get priority for scarce aluminium? How many aircraft can be diverted to protect convoys in the Atlantic without stripping fighter command bare? Sinclair fights bureaucratic turf wars as fiercely as he ever fought political debates. He leans on ministers, bullies, civil servants, courts industrialists, all with one aim, to keep the squadrons in the air. That summer, the Air Ministry becomes a nerve center of controlled panic. Telephones ring constantly. Bandits crossing the coast. 20 plus, height unknown. Reports are shouted across rooms. Messengers run from plotting tables to radio operators. When the great air battles rage over Kent and Sussex, Sinclair is often downstairs in the operations room, eyes fixed on the colored markers that represent real aircraft flown by real men. Each time a marker is tipped on its side to indicate a missing machine, he feels it like a physical blow. At night, he drives out to fighter stations. He talks to tired pilots with bloodshot eyes, to ground crews black with oil and dust, to controllers who have been on duty for 18 hours straight. He shakes hands, listens, promises better supplies, more spare parts, more men. They see the slight stoop in his shoulders, the lines deepening around his mouth, but also the unwavering attention when they speak. He knows what it is to wait for orders that might kill you. They sense it. Then comes the twist no one quite expected. The RAF holds. The Luftwaffe, battered and frustrated, fails to break fighter command. Hitler turns away from the invasion he never dares launch. In the cabinet room, Churchill immortalizes the few in oratory that will echo for generations. Posters appear. Young, clean-jawed pilots under heroic skies. The myth takes shape. But myths have shadows. Inside the Air Ministry, Sinclair sees them first. Bomber Command is demanding more resources to take the war to Germany at night. Coastal Command insists the U-boat threat in the Atlantic could strangle Britain before any invasion fleet appears. Training Command pleads that squadrons cannot be fed indefinitely by scraping the bottom of the barrel. Victory in one battle has not stopped the clock. It has simply wound it tighter. When the Blitz begins, Sinclair's world splits in two. By day, he sits in meetings about production targets, airfield construction, the allocation of fighter cover to convoys and to the Middle East. By night, he drives or walks through burning streets. London under bombardment is a hallucination. Firestorms turning entire blocks into orange furnaces, glass glittering like ice on pavements. The sweet, sickly smell of things that were never meant to burn. He visits bombed districts with local MPs, listening to exhausted women in doorways demand to know why the enemy can still fly over their homes. Every one of those questions cuts. He does what no politician enjoys. He explains that there are limits. The Luftwaffe can fly because the RAF must also be in the Middle East, must guard factories in the Midlands, must protect convoys. To defend everything is to defend nothing. Strategy is a language he is fluent in. Grief is not. In private, he paces his office long after midnight, the blackout curtains drawn tight, the only light a green-shaded lamp on his own desk as he reads after-action reports in a silence broken only by the distant thump of bombs. In these years, the rivalry with Churchill takes on an almost theatrical intensity. Churchill wants spectacular offensives, bold raids that will show the world Britain is striking back. Sinclair, working with the chiefs of staff, knows the brutal maths of attrition. There are quarrels over priorities, over whether scarce heavy bombers should be risked on daring but marginally useful operations. In cabinet, the exchanges can be sharp. Churchill jabs at the table with a cigar. Sinclair answers in clipped, controlled tones, never raising his voice but never quite yielding either. Yet they need each other. Churchill's political weight forces through vast increases in aircraft production and the building of new shadow factories. Sinclair's persistence ensures that much of that output actually reaches squadrons rather than dying in committee. When American aid and then American airmen arrive, it is Sinclair who must weave the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces into a single, coherent strategy. Meetings with American generals, brash, energetic, full of ideas about daylight bombing, stretch late into the night. For a Highland laird who once walked peat bogs with tenants, it is a surreal transformation. Now he sits at tables littered with coffee, cups and ashtrays, arguing over whether to bomb ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt or rail yards in France. The deeper the war goes, the heavier his moral burden becomes. Bomber Command's campaign against Germany escalates. The official language is bland. Area attacks, industrial targets. But Sinclair knows what is really happening. Reports from intelligence officers, from the Ministry of Information, from neutral observers all tell the same story. German cities, reduced to smoking grids, firestorms consuming not just factories but whole neighborhoods, civilians, women, children, the elderly, dying in numbers that are impossible to look at as just statistics. Here, his liberal instincts collide head-on with wartime necessity. He pushes quietly, sometimes futilely, for a tighter focus on truly military and industrial targets. He asks uncomfortable questions about whether every city must be burned, whether more could be done to warn civilians, whether the long-term moral damage is worth the short-term military advantage. In some cases, he wins small concessions. In others, he is simply outvoted. Churchill, tempted at times by the idea of terror bombing, is hardly a natural ally on this front. The conflict between them becomes more than professional. It is about what Britain will look like in the mirror when the war is over. At the same time, another clock is ticking that only a few politicians can hear clearly. The countdown to peace, and to the reckoning that will follow. While fighting the most total war in British history, Sinclair must also somehow keep the Liberal Party alive. Between meetings at the Air Ministry, he snatches time to talk with local organizers, to write letters to constituencies, to craft war aims that look beyond victory toward reconstruction. He argues inside cabinet that post-war Britain cannot simply snap back to the old patterns. He backs plans for education reform, for full employment, for a reformed international order. The Beveridge Report, which will lay the foundations of the modern welfare state, comes before ministers. Sinclair is among those who greet it enthusiastically. Here, at least, he finds himself closer to Labour than to many conservatives. Churchill, focused relentlessly on the war, often sees these discussions as distractions. But Sinclair knows that if Liberals offer nothing distinct when peace comes, they will be washed away in the tide. The dual life is exhausting. In the morning, he signs orders that will send bombers over Germany. In the afternoon, he debates the structure of a future United Nations. In the evening, he attends to party correspondence, reading letters from old supporters who wonder why the Liberals seem so invisible. Beneath the great Churchillian shadow, he is fighting two battles with one pair of hands, knowing that victory in one does not guarantee survival in the other. By 1944, the air war has changed shape again. The Luftwaffe is being ground down. Allied air power dominates. Now the challenge is to harness that dominance for the coming invasion of Europe. Sinclair is enmeshed in the intricate planning for Operation Overlord. Massive air transport to drop paratroopers, endless fighter, sorties to keep the beaches clear of enemy aircraft, months of bombing railways, bridges and depots in France to isolate the battlefield. Some of the crucial debates are waged not over maps of Germany, but over the chalk cliffs of Normandy. How many French civilians is it acceptable to kill in the process of cutting German rail lines? How close to the beaches should heavy bombing fall? Generals and air marshals argue in calm, deadly phrases about acceptable loss ratios. Sinclair, who still remembers the smell of scorched flesh from the Western Front, must sign off on plans that will flatten villages. Friendly to Britain's cause, the only comfort is that, this time, each bomb will help open the door to liberation. On the night before D-Day, the Air Ministry is almost eerily calm. The decisions have been made. The aircraft are fueled. Outside, in airfields across southern England, thousands of machines wait in rows, black against the dark. Sinclair walks through his nearly silent building, past rooms cleaned for once of their usual clutter, and feels the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. For 4 years, everything has been building toward this. There will be no second chance. In the days that follow, tension turns to a strange, breathless elation. Reports come in. The airborne drops have largely succeeded. Beachheads have been established. Allied air superiority is near total. The nightmare that haunted every planner, that the RAF would fail at the critical moment, does not come to pass. The invasion works. Behind the jubilant headlines and the iconic photographs, there is the invisible infrastructure of policy, production, and sheer stubborn administration that Sinclair has spent years constructing. He will never be the face of D-Day, but the skies above it are part of his legacy. By late 1944, however, another twist is coming into view, and this one is political. Churchill's government is under growing pressure to define its post-war intentions more clearly. Labour ministers, sensing the public mood, begin to stake out bold positions on housing, health, and social security. Sinclair tries to pull the Liberals into the conversation as a decisive, progressive force. But the old organizational weaknesses bite hard. The party is short of money, short of active associations, short of time. Inside the cabinet, the war's endgame coincides with sharper ideological clashes. Churchill resists full commitment to some of Beveridge's proposals. Labour pushes hard. Sinclair finds himself again in the uncomfortable middle, arguing for generous reconstruction and civil liberties while trying not to fracture the coalition before Germany is defeated. He wins some arguments, loses others. The public sees only occasional flashes of these struggles. Most of the credit, and most of the resentment, still flows toward Churchill. When Germany finally surrenders in May 1945, London erupts in cathartic chaos. Crowds throng Whitehall and Trafalgar Square, climbing lampposts, dancing in fountains, shouting until their voices give out. On the balcony of the Ministry of Health, Churchill waves his hat at a sea of faces that roar his name. Somewhere nearby, in far more modest offices, Sinclair signs the last of the wartime Air Ministry papers and begins the slow handover to a peacetime successor. The machine he helped build is already being dismantled and reshaped for a world without Nazism. But peace brings with it a brutal deadline. The coalition cannot last. An election must be called. The Liberal Party, which had survived the 1930s by clinging to principle, now faces the electorate after 5 years of near invisibility at the national level. Voters know Churchill. They increasingly know Attlee. They barely remember what the Liberals are for. And Sinclair, exhausted, aging, still carrying the weight of every pilot lost on his watch, must suddenly switch from war leader back to party campaigner. The rivalry with Churchill, once a matter of strategy and style inside government, now explodes into the open in the strangest possible way. Churchill is overwhelmingly popular as a war hero, but his party's domestic record and instincts are distrusted by many. Labour has a simple story to tell. Let us build the peace. Sinclair struggles to give the Liberals a distinct, compelling narrative that is not merely a softer echo of Labour's or a faint, apologetic defense of Churchill's. He campaigns across Caithness and Sutherland, then down to England and back again, trying to be in 3 places at once. In village halls battered by 6 years of war, he speaks of civil liberties, of internationalism, of balanced social reform that avoids both reaction and state tyranny. He reminds listeners that liberals fought fascism long before it was fashionable, that they defended refugees when others closed the door. Some audiences listen with real warmth. Others are politely distant, their minds already made up. Above all, he is racing the clock one last time. The same man who once counted squadrons must now count votes. He knows the danger. If he loses his seat, the Liberal leader will be decapitated at the very moment the party needs him most. The ghost of 1924, that bitter journey north in defeat, hovers on the edge of his thoughts. He pushes it away, focusing on handshakes, on doorstep conversations, on the sense that surely, after all he has done for the nation, his own constituents will not abandon him. Election night, July 1945. The war in Europe is over. The war in the Pacific still raging far away. Britain stands in the half-light between sacrifice and reconstruction. Results come in slowly, on crackling radio bulletins and in telegrams carried into smoke-filled counting rooms. Across the country, pillars of the old order fall. Grandees who assumed their names were enough are swept away by a wave of reformist anger and hope. In Caithness and Sutherland, the count stretches into the small hours. Bundles of paper, each marked with a choice for the future, pass under tired eyes. When the returning officer finally mounts the platform, Sinclair stands with his opponents, face impassive, hands clasped lightly behind his back. The numbers are read out. The words are simple. The impact is not. He has lost. The room seems to tilt slightly. Applause, polite, even sympathetic, washes around him as the new member is declared. Journalists scribble notes. Former Liberal leader defeated. For a second time in his life, Archibald Sinclair has gone from the high offices of state to private citizen in a single announcement. This time, the fall is even steeper. He leaves the hall with his agent, the night air cool on his face, the sky above him peaceful in a way it has not been for years. The RAF he helped forge owns these skies beyond challenge. But he no longer owns a seat in the house that sent those planes out. Somewhere in London, Churchill, the man whose career has intertwined with his like a double helix of alliance and competition, is hearing his own shock. His party has lost, despite his personal glory. He is out of Downing Street. Attlee will form a Labour government. The two old comrades turned rivals are, in different ways, both thrown from power at the same moment. For Sinclair, the irony is almost cruel. He has helped win the war and lost the peace, at least in personal terms. The clock that dictated every decision of his wartime life has stopped. A new one is starting, and it will tick in a different rhythm. Slower, more reflective, with no staff officers standing by and no war cabinet table waiting. The question now is not how he will direct the forces of the air, or hold together a crumbling party in a world on fire, but what A man like him does when history's spotlight moves on. The man who once helped decide the fate of nations now stands in a village counting hall, where the future is measured in crumpled ballot papers. Hours earlier, officers in crisp uniforms saluted him as Secretary of State for Air. Now a tired clerk, jacket off, simply reads out the numbers that end his career. It is like watching a bomber plunge from the sky in slow motion. No flames, no explosion, just a long, helpless fall into silence. Outside, the July night is almost indecently peaceful. No sirens, no searchlights, no distant growl of engines. For the first time in years, the sky above Archibald Sinclair is empty, and he has never felt so exposed. He walks away from the hall with his agent, each footstep on the flagstones sounding too loud. No escort, no car with a flag on the bonnet, no waiting official papers. Just a narrow street, dim lamps, the soft hiss of the sea somewhere beyond the roofs, and the knowledge that the voters of Caithness and Sutherland have calmly dismissed the man who sat at the war cabinet table. They knew, someone says behind him in a low, embarrassed voice. They must know what he did. Just. But that is the first brutal lesson of peace. Gratitude is not a political currency that lasts. In the days that follow, Sinclair goes through the necessary motions as if walking through smoke. He resigns the leadership of the Liberal Party, passing a nearly threadbare banner to Clement Davies. Letters arrive from across the country, some warm, some vicious, most simply factual. Dear Sir, I regret your defeat. Dear Mr. Sinclair, you should never have joined with the Conservatives. Dear Air Chief, thank you for saving my son's life. The country is in love with the idea of change, and the Liberals look too much like the past. The party he tried to save in the 1930s has been squeezed almost to nothing between a victorious Labour and a wounded but still colossal Conservative machine. The third force has been reduced to a scattering of MPs on the green benches, like survivors clinging to driftwood after a shipwreck. And hanging over all of it is the familiar, bitter figure of Winston Churchill. Both men are out of office. Both have lost something they believed was theirs by right of effort and sacrifice. Yet the contrast could not be sharper. Churchill steps away from Downing Street and into immortality. Books, portraits, jokes, and smoke-filled clubs. His legend begins almost instantly. Sinclair steps away from the Air Ministry into obscurity. No crowds wait beneath his window. No school children are taught his speeches. His work, like the contrails of a high-flying aircraft, melts into the background of history almost as soon as it is made. Back at his home in the far north, the silence is almost aggressive. For years, his days were punctuated by urgent knocks, telephones ringing, cars arriving at all hours. Now there are long mornings where the loudest sound is the wind worrying at the eaves and the sea beating itself to foam against the Caithness rocks. He walks his land, the same fields and moors where he once listened to crofters' complaints as a young laird, and tries to reconcile the sheer normality of sheep and heather with the knowledge that, a few months ago, his decisions altered the course of a continent. He is still Lord Lieutenant of Caithness, still the chief to many in the county. There are handshakes on market days, deferential nods from older men who remember the war. But even here, the new Labour government's promises of houses, jobs, and health care are on everyone's lips. The world is turning, and it is turning past him, yet he refuses to vanish. If he cannot speak in the Commons, he will work in the shadows. He writes to colleagues, prods local Liberal associations, offers advice that is sometimes welcomed and sometimes, painfully, not. A younger generation of radicals looks at this tall, courteous aristocrat and wonders if he truly understands the desperate, hungry mood of post-war Britain. They see a figure of the last great crisis. They are already thinking about the next. The rivalry with Churchill becomes, in these years, a competition for memory rather than for power. Churchill's war memoirs begin to appear, thick volumes that instantly dominate political conversation. They are dramatic, self-assured, shot through with his own sense of destiny. Sinclair reads them with a mixture of admiration and frustration. He recognizes scenes where he was present, turns pages looking for his own name, and finds, at best, a sentence, a footnote, a passing mention. He could write his own account. He is urged. Publishers would be interested. A book by the man who steered the RAF through its darkest hours. The idea hangs in the air like a tempting but dangerous mission. He sketches notes, dictates fragments to a secretary, but the habit of a lifetime pulls him back. He is used to being the man behind the pilots, not the one painted on the poster. The story he would tell is complicated, full of doubts and half-wins, moral gray zones and bitter cabinet fights. The story the public apparently wants is simple. Churchill, the RAF, the few, the victory. Complication loses. For now. The honors list brings its own twist. He is appointed to the Order of the Companions of Honor, a recognition that glitters nicely in the newspapers for a day or two before. The nation moves on to bread, coal, and coupon books. Then, in 1952, comes something stranger, a letter offering a peerage. He will sit in Parliament again, but not as a fighting, heckling MP. He will be Viscount Thurso, in the hushed, red-carpeted world of the House of Lords. To some liberals, this looks like a velvet-lined burial, a peerage for a party leader whose troops have already melted away, a tidy way to file him under past. To Sinclair himself, it feels like a compromise dictated by time. If he accepts, he can still speak, still vote, still help shape policy in some fashion. If he refuses, he risks disappearing altogether, leaving the battlefield without even a rearguard action. He accepts. Archibald Henry MacDonald. Sinclair becomes the first Viscount Thurso, and the boy who once rode ponies over Caithness Hills now walks into a chamber heavy with crimson and gold, full of voices from older ages of empire. It is a strange new theater for a man who once lived with the throb of Merlin engines in his ears. By now, though, he can feel a different clock ticking, one that no election can reset. Years of war work, long nights, broken sleep, and constant tension have left their mark. In the same year as his elevation, he suffers a stroke. It does not kill him, but it lands like a bomb in the middle of his carefully planned second act. For a time, movement and speech are difficult. Doctors lean over his bed with that grave, falsely reassuring tone that tells him more than their words. You must slow down. You must accept limits. You no longer have an endless runway ahead of you. Suddenly, every piece of business, every speech, every meeting, every letter, acquires a new edge. How many years of real work are left? 10? 5? Less? The man who once measured endurance in aircraft hours and sortie rates now counts it in heartbeats. In those constrained years, Sinclair chooses his battles carefully. He speaks in the Lords on the issues that have always defined him. Civil liberties, international cooperation, the urgent need to avoid the mistakes that fed fascism between the wars. When Suez explodes in 1956, Britain, France, and Israel conspiring to seize the canal from Nasser, he recognizes at once the deadly mixture, imperial nostalgia, secrecy, disdain for international law. The details are different, but the pattern feels horribly familiar. From his place on the red benches, slower in step but still clear in purpose, he warns against the folly of pretending that Britain can still bully the world as it once did. Around him, older conservatives bristle. Some younger peers nod, surprised at the clarity from this half-forgotten wartime minister. The Liberals are by now reduced almost to a ghostly presence in the Commons. But in the Lords, Sinclair's voice still carries the old Liberal insistence that power must be bound by principle. All the while, the rivalry with Churchill continues in a new, ghostly form. Churchill has returned to Downing Street, only to leave again under the weight of age and illness. He, too, is now in the Lords. They sometimes share the same physical space. Two elderly men whose names were once linked daily in classified files and strategics, memos, now sitting on opposite sides of a chamber that rarely fills for debates on air policy or civil liberty. There is no grand final confrontation, no thunderous clash of titans, just the small, aching details. The way Churchill, nearly deaf and half-blind, still commands the attention of a room when he shuffles in. The way reporters still hang on his occasional words. Sinclair, by contrast, can deliver a well-argued speech that barely merits a paragraph in the next day's press. History has chosen its giant. The other man, who matched him, move for move through the crucial years, is slowly being edited out. Yet legacy has a longer fuse than headlines. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a thin green shoot appears through the cracked paving stones of British politics. A new generation of liberals, most famously Joe Grimond, begins to talk of realignment, of breaking the suffocating two-party embrace. They speak of Europe, of decolonization, of civil rights, of the need to humanize industrial society without crushing freedom. Listening from the sidelines, Sinclair hears familiar cadences in unfamiliar voices. He meets some of these younger men, offers shrewd, occasionally sharp advice. Do not become Labor's tail, he warns. Do not become the conservatives' conscience for hire. Stand for something clear. Internationalism, social justice without authoritarianism, individual rights. The words are old. The world they land in is new. Nuclear weapons, television, the Cold War forged in iron curtains and missile trails. This is not the landscape he knew. But the core arguments have not changed as much as the technology has. There is one twist he could never have scripted. His own family will carry the flame. His son, Robin, after succeeding him as Viscount Thurso, will become a leading figure in the Liberal Party's Scottish organization. His grandson, John, will one day sit in the very House of Commons that expelled Archie in 1945, a Liberal Democrat MP for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross. The seat that spat out the wartime air minister will one day welcome his blood back as a champion of a reborn liberal tradition. He does not live to see all of this, but he sees enough to suspect that the story is not over. The party he feared would die in the rubble of 1945 stubbornly refuses to go away. It hangs on in by-elections, in council chambers, in the minds of young idealists irritated by the rigid Labour-Conservative duel. Sinclair, frailer now, walking with a stick, watching more than he speaks, realizes that his true competition with Churchill was never about who held which office when. It was about which vision of Britain would have descendants. Churchill's vision, heroic, defiant, anchored in an imperial past but capable of extraordinary democratic mobilization, dominates the war years and the early memory of them. Sinclair's quieter vision of a Britain outward-looking, committed to human rights, wary of militarism even while mastering it, goes underground, to re-emerge later in places he cannot yet see. The final years are, in many ways, a long landing. No more frantic dashes between Whitehall buildings. No more midnight calls from embassies or airfields. Instead, letters, family gatherings, visits to old squadrons now flying sleek jet aircraft that make the Spitfires of his prime look like toys from another century. He watches them roar overhead at air displays and feels something twist inside. Pride, certainly, and also a faint, inescapable unease. Humanity has taken flight and turned it into an instrument of total annihilation. The bombs he once tried to direct with some restraint have now been replaced by weapons that can erase cities in a heartbeat. He speaks, when asked, for disarmament conferences, for careful arms control, for international cooperation that might keep the worst from happening. His words do not carry the weight they once did, but they add to a chorus, a liberal chorus, insisting that survival and freedom must be balanced. In a world of button pushers and doctrine writers, that is no small legacy. On 15th of June 1970, in his 80th year, the clock that had ruled his life finally runs down. There is no air raid siren marking the moment, no urgent knocking on doors, no late-night cabinet summons. Just a quiet drawing to a close in a country that is, at last, at peace. New politicians are already crowding the stage. Edward Heath, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher waiting in the wings. The newspapers that once quoted him daily now give him a few inches of respectful obituary. Former Liberal leader, Secretary of State for Air during Second World War, played key role in development of Royal Air Force. The phrases are accurate and hopelessly inadequate, because behind those cool lines lies the true drama. A man who began life as a Highland laird's son, who trudged through the mud of one world war and negotiated the thin, freezing air of another, who fought to keep his party alive while the political weather howled, who argued with Churchill across cabinet tables, and then, years later, across the gulf of history itself. A man who spent his most intense years racing against clocks, electoral, military, mortal, and who almost never had the luxury of easy victories. In the end, the rivalry that seemed to define him in the public eye is revealed as something more complex. Churchill became a monument. Sinclair became, in a sense, an invisible architect. You do not see his face in statues on Parliament Square. You feel his presence in something harder to depict. A tradition of British liberalism that refused to die, in an air force that moved, from desperate improvisation to enduring institution, in a political culture that, for all its failings, still instinctively distrusts the total state. His life after power looks, at first glance, like a long epilogue. Seen more closely, it is a different kind of battle. To ensure that the means Britain used to survive its darkest hours did not poison the peace that followed. To keep alive, in modest committee rooms and half-empty chambers, the stubborn idea that freedom and security are not enemies but partners that must constantly renegotiate their terms. That idea outlives him. It is the quiet, persistent contrail in the clear post-war sky, fading, reforming, but always there when you look up.